You think everyone loves Bob Dylan? I mean, the guy's a Nobel laureate, the voice of a generation, a living legend. But what if I told you that one of rock's most respected female artists called him a total fraud and a plagiarist right to his face? Or that a punk icon said his voice was unbearable and his fans were just a bunch of brainwashed sheep? For decades, Dylan's cryptic lyrics and take-it-or-leave-it voice haven't just confused people, they've straight-up infuriated his fellow musicians. Today, we're not talking about friendly rivalries. We're counting down 5 legendary artists who didn't just dislike Dylan, they publicly tore him down, calling him a fake, a thief, and a sellout. These are the stories the superfans really don't want you to hear. Bob Dylan is a giant of 20th-century music. It's impossible to escape his influence, from his early days as the folk messiah of Greenwich Village, to his Judas moment when he went electric, all the way to becoming a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote anthems for the civil rights movement, completely changed what a pop song could even be, and lit a fire under countless artists, from the Beatles to Bruce Springsteen. But in the dog-eat-dog world of rock and roll, being a genius can also make you a target. While millions worshipped him, some of his most famous peers were sharpening their knives. We've sifted through decades of scathing interviews, bitter public statements, and wild behind-the-scenes stories to get to the truth. These aren't just whispers or rumors, this is documented, unfiltered hate from some of the biggest names in the business. So, let's get into it. Kicking off our list isn't just one artist, but a whole movement that felt so stabbed in the back by Bob Dylan that they basically kicked him out of their club. In the early 60s, Dylan was the undisputed king of the folk scene. With just his acoustic guitar and a harmonica, he sang songs like "Blowin' in the Wind" and became the conscience for a generation of activists. His mentors and friends, people like the legendary Pete Seeger, saw him as the future, a powerful new voice for justice. But then came July 25, 1965, at the Newport Folk Festival, and everything fell apart. This was supposed to be Dylan's victory lap. Instead, he walked on stage with a full rock band and plugged in an electric guitar. What came out of the speakers wasn't the gentle, acoustic poetry everyone was there for, it was loud, raw, and in your face. To the folk purists in the crowd and backstage, this was an act of treason. They saw it as a greedy, commercial betrayal of everything they believed in. The boos started almost immediately. But the real drama was happening off stage. 2 of the biggest names in the folk world, Erwin Silber, who was the editor of Sing Out magazine, and Scottish folk singer Ewan MacColl, were absolutely furious. They publicly accused Dylan of ditching his political duties to sell out to pop radio. MacColl called his new music a shallow grab for fame, and Silber wrote blistering articles saying Dylan had lost touch with the people. To them, this wasn't art, it was a rejection of everything real and authentic. But the most famous story from that day involves one of Dylan's own mentors, Pete Seeger. Seeger, a folk icon himself, was reportedly so enraged by the loud, distorted mess of the electric band that he wanted it over. The legend goes that Seeger threatened to grab an axe and cut the power cables. While Seeger later said his main problem was that the sound was so bad you couldn't hear Dylan's words, the image of him wanting to literally pull the plug says everything about the sense of betrayal that day. In one afternoon, Dylan went from their Messiah to their Judas, a label that would follow him for years. The folk purists didn't just dislike his new music, they hated what it stood for, the death of their idealistic dream, killed by the very man they thought would save it. At number 4, we have a more recent and way more direct takedown. Chris France, the drummer for the legendary new wave band Talking Heads, didn't have a problem with Dylan over folk music. His beef came from a single, dismissive sentence Dylan wrote in his 2022 book, The Philosophy of Modern Song. In the book, Dylan reflects on songs by other artists, and in his chapter on Elvis Costello's Pump It Up, he dropped this line: Elvis Costello and his band, The Attractions, were a better band than any of their contemporaries. Light years better. Now, for most people, that just sounds like high praise for Costello. But for Chris Frantz, whose band Talking Heads was one of the most celebrated and groundbreaking groups of that exact same era, it felt like a slap in the face. It was a huge generalization that just erased the entire late 70s and early 80s scene, not just Talking Heads, but bands like The Clash, The Ramones, and Blondie. Frantz was stunned and pretty insulted. He told Rolling Stone, "When I read that, I just thought, Jesus, Bob. I understand you dig Elvis Costello, but did you have to put it that way?" Frantz decided to fire back publicly, and he did not hold back. He got on Facebook and, after saying he loved Dylan's book, he went right for the throat. He wrote, "With all due respect to the attractions, I'd like to say to Bob something he once said to a buddy of mine. Suck a dick." The insult was shocking, personal, and it came with a story. Frantz explained that the line was a direct quote. A friend of his had once tried to compliment the famously grumpy Dylan, who just turned and snarled, "Do I know you?" "No, I don't know you. Suck a dick." By throwing Dylan's own nasty words back at him, Frantz wasn't just defending his band. He was calling out what he saw as Dylan's arrogance. Frantz later said he wasn't trying to start a war and that he respected all the great bands from that time. His problem was with Dylan's tone. It was a classic case of an idol showing he wasn't perfect. For Frantz, Dylan wasn't just a songwriting god, he was also kind of a jerk, and Frantz wasn't going to let that go unanswered. Frank Zappa was a musical wizard, a ridiculous guitarist, a genius composer, and a guy who had absolutely zero patience for bullshit. He loved to provoke and mock the pretensions of the music world, and one of his favorite targets was Bob Dylan. Zappa's dislike wasn't about one specific incident, it was a deep, philosophical belief that Dylan was basically a hack. He seemed to see Dylan not as a poet, but as a master of stuff that just sounded smart. Zappa's insults were brutal and often hilarious. He famously called Dylan's signature gravelly voice a tragic accident. He laughed at Dylan's famous lyrics, calling them pseudo-intellectual ramblings. And he didn't just hate the music, he had a special kind of contempt for Dylan's fans, who he saw as brainwashed sheep for buying into the whole myth. In Zappa's world, Dylan wasn't a prophet, he was a product. Now, Zappa did admit that Dylan's early stuff had some merit. He said the album Highway 61 Revisited was really good, but claimed that by the time Blonde on Blonde came out, it just sounded like cowboy music. And as Zappa put it, "You know what I think of cowboy music." His most famous comment, though, was about "like a Rolling Stone." Zappa said when he first heard it, he felt it was so powerful that if it actually succeeded in its mission, he wouldn't need to make music anymore. But then came the punchline, "But it didn't do anything." It sold but nobody responded to it in the way that they should have. He felt the song's revolutionary message was totally wasted. The weirdest part of all this? In 1982, Dylan just showed up at Zappa's house, hoping to get Zappa to produce the album that would become Infidels. Dylan played him some songs, and Zappa was apparently open to it, though he made it clear he was 180 degrees away from this religious shit Dylan was into then. The team-up never happened, supposedly because they couldn't agree on money. But it's one of the great what-ifs in music. Zappa's hatred was smart, funny, and consistent. He saw through the mystique and wasn't afraid to say the emperor of folk rock was wearing no clothes. For our number 2 spot, we're stepping just outside of music to bring in a voice so respected that his opinion was like a cultural atom bomb. Kurt Vonnegut, the legendary author of Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle, was one of America's most beloved writers. He was a master of satire, a humanist, a counterculture icon, and he absolutely, positively could not stand Bob Dylan's songwriting. Vonnegut's criticism is so damaging because it attacks Dylan on his home turf, his lyrics. While Dylan's fans, and even the Nobel Prize Committee, have called him one of the greatest poets of our time. Vonnegut saw things differently. In a now infamous 1991 interview with Hustler magazine, Vonnegut was asked about music. He gave a thumbs up to the Beatles for their substantial contribution, but then he turned on Dylan and delivered one of the most savage literary takedowns ever. Bob Dylan, however, is the worst poet alive, Vonnegut said, plain and simple. He then added, he can maybe get one good line in a song, and the rest is gibberish. Coming from a writer of Vonnegut's caliber, this wasn't just an insult, it was a final judgment. He was basically throwing Dylan's entire legacy in the trash. The man who gave us So It Goes was saying that the man who wrote How Does It Feel was a fraud. That quote has echoed for decades, a permanent black mark on Dylan's literary reputation. It wasn't just a random jab, it was the considered opinion of a master of the English language. Vonnegut, whose own writing was loved for its sharp clarity and simple wisdom, had no time for what he saw as Dylan's lyrical fog. And even though Vonnegut passed away before Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016, you can just imagine the sarcastic, cutting commentary he would have had about the worst poet alive getting the world's biggest literary award. And here we are, at the #1 spot. If the folk purists felt betrayed by Dylan, and Zappa and Vonnegut were intellectually disgusted by him, then Joanie Mitchell's criticism is something else entirely. It's personal, it's professional, and it comes from one of the few artists who could truly look him in the eye as an equal. Mitchell, a folk titan herself and one of the most innovative songwriters of her generation, has repeatedly and publicly destroyed Bob Dylan, attacking his talent, his voice, and his very identity. For years, people saw Mitchell and Dylan as the king and queen of poetic folk rock. But Mitchell always hated that comparison, and in a shocking 2010 interview with the Los Angeles Times, she made it crystal clear why. "We are like night and day, Dylan and I," she said, before dropping this bombshell. "Bob is not authentic at all. He's a plagiarist, and his name and voice are fake. Everything about Bob is a deception." That single quote is probably the most damning thing ever said about Dylan by a major peer. Mitchell wasn't just questioning his art, she was calling him a complete and total fraud. The plagiarism charge has followed Dylan for years, but Mitchell framed it as outright theft. She even went after his carefully built persona, from his stage name, he was born Robert Zimmerman, to his famous vocal style. And she kept going. Musically, Dylan's not very gifted, she stated. He's borrowed his voice from old hillbillies. He's got a lot of borrowed things. In her eyes, Dylan had just created a character, calling it a mask of sorts. This is especially brutal coming from Mitchell, an artist famous for her own stunning musical originality and deeply confessional lyrics. While she has sometimes tried to soften her comments, the basic feeling has never changed. Her song, Talk to Me, is even seen by many as a direct shot at Dylan, the Mr. Mystery, who she wishes would just drop the act. Joanie Mitchell's criticisms cut so deep because she's coming from a place of pure artistry. She sees herself as an original, and in her eyes, Dylan is just a clever thief, patching together borrowed parts into something that looks real, but is ultimately hollow. For her, it isn't a rivalry, it's about artistic integrity. And her verdict couldn't be clearer: Bob Dylan is a fake. So there you have it. From being accused of betraying a whole movement, to being called a dick by a new wave drummer. From being labeled a pseudo-intellectual by Frank Zappa, to being called the worst poet alive by Kurt Vonnegut. And finally, being branded a plagiarist and a complete fraud by the one and only Joanie Mitchell. It's pretty clear that for all the awards and adoration, Bob Dylan's career has also been defined by the hatred he inspired in his peers. These aren't just small spats. They're huge fights over what it means to be an artist, what's authentic, and where you draw the line between being inspired and just stealing. While millions see a genius, Thes. 5 Legend saw something very, very different: a manipulator, a sellout, and a charlatan. But maybe that's the real sign of a truly great artist, someone who can inspire not just love, but also passionate, intelligent, and unwavering hate. What do you think? Are these criticisms fair, or is it all just professional jealousy? Let me know which musician's takedown of Dylan surprised you the most in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip into music history's biggest feuds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories behind the music. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss what's next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.